A U.S. military blockade on Iran's ports is now in effect. President Donald Trump says the blockade is aimed at preventing Iran from blackmailing the world. U.S. Central Command confirmed the blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports. When asked whether the end game was to force Iran back to the negotiating table or open up the strait, Trump replied, maybe everything.
Maybe everything. I mean, both of those things, certainly, and more. We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world, because that's what they're doing. They're really blackmailing the world. We're not going to let that happen.
Echoing Trump's sentiments, U.S. Vice President JD Vance accused Iran of economic terrorism over its blockade of the strait. He added, and I'm quoting, "Two can play that game."
We need to see the Straits of Hormuz fully open. And this is frankly one of the things where the Iranians tried to move the goalposts during the negotiation. We made very clear that that's unacceptable.
The U.S. military has deployed at least 15 warships across the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea east of the strait. The blockade will be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports or coastal areas, but it will not impede vessels in the Strait of Hormuz traveling to and from non-Iranian ports. Iran has branded the blockade an act of piracy and warned that if the security of its harbors is threatened, no port in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea will be safe.
Iran's policy in the Strait of Hormuz is clear. Any action that threatens Iran's security will be met with a proportional response. Any act against Iranian vessels will draw a corresponding response. Any harm to Iran's national interests will inevitably create security vulnerabilities that could endanger the safety of the American people.
Iran's ambassador to the United Nations has condemned the blockade as a grave violation of its sovereignty. In a letter to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Amir Said Iravani said the unlawful blockade constitutes a serious violation of the fundamental principles of the international law of the sea. Thousands rallied in Tehran in support of the government and against the U.S. blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing, the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, has criticized the blockade, emphasizing the strait's importance to trade. Underlining Beijing's trade and energy agreements with Iran, China has cautioned U.S. against blocking its ships. Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun warned U.S. not to interfere in China's bilateral affairs with Iran, adding that Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz and it remains open for China. International Maritime Organization has said that additional restrictive measures will not help resolve the ongoing crisis, stressing that de-escalation is key to restoring normal shipping operations. The UN's maritime agency says no country has a legal right to block shipping in straits used for international transit. Now, Trump has also claimed that U.S. allies want to help with the operation. Well, so far, no country, including its NATO allies, has pledged support. All right, to discuss more, we're now being joined live from Oslo by Dr. Glenn Diesen, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Doctor, I would like to begin with this reaction of China. This is, of course, the first time we've seen a very strong reaction from China. They say that Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz and it remains open for China. Now, I would like to ask, is this a way of U.S. to pressure China into pressuring Iran to get on the negotiating table?
Well, it could be, but also I think the Chinese, they probably see that the war against Iran is to some extent also aimed against China by cutting off a key energy supplier to China and seeking to disrupt its energy supplies. But so of course it is probably on some level an economic war against China as well. But of course they want the Chinese to put pressure on Iran because Iran won't bow to any threats by its enemies. So perhaps friendly countries can put some pressure on it. This is certainly part of the calculus, I would think. And but this is also the risk of spreading the war further. It's not just an escalation between the United States and Iran. It also spreads the war, because what they're essentially saying is the United States is now also disrupting the trade of China. So what does this blockade mean? Are the Americans going to start stopping ships from China, India? This is quite, it's quite problematic.
And so to say that it's interesting to now think about when he said that he wants to open the Strait of Hormuz, and now what we see is none of the ships are allowed to go. So it seems like it is now blocked by the U.S. So what could be the goals of Trump or U.S. at this point? What do they want? What do they want to do with blocking this Strait of Hormuz?
Well, Iranian control over Strait of Hormuz is a big problem for the United States, because for one, they can collect toll that is as a way of having reparation from the destruction that has been done in Iran. They can also put pressure on countries to trade in non-US currencies, which would then challenge the petrodollar. And they can also put pressure on the countries in the Gulf states to not host this offensive U.S. military bases, which have now attacked Iran. So I think so this is why Iran is facilitating a selective access. I think the United States calculating that if they put a complete ban on the Strait of Hormuz, then this will be more in their favor. At least then they won't have the same geoeconomic leverage for the Iranians. So I think that's the main motivation from the United States. That being said, of course, the whole thing is a bit deceptive, because we've gone into this 2-week ceasefire in which the Americans agreed to the 10-point plan as the point of departure for the Iranians. And yet now we're seeing this massive escalation during the ceasefire. So this is this can spread the war by bringing in other powers which are dependent on energy from Iran, but it can also escalate it, as I assume the Iranians will not sit idly by while their ports are under blockade, and they will likely hit the ports in the Gulf states as well.
Right, and that's exactly what I was coming to, because they have warned clearly that no port in the Persian Gulf or Sea of Oman would remain safe. Its own ports are if its ports are targeted, and especially it targets the Gulf, these ports, especially of UAE and Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is one particular nation that has been, and these Gulf nations, rather, I would say, they haven't been retaliating as such towards Iran. Do you think that this would lead them to take action?
Well, they could. Well, to some extent, they already taken action indirectly, because they hosted and indirectly participated in the attack on Iran. So they're already engaged. Whether or not they will attack directly, I think this could be problematic, because the Iranians could respond more harshly against targets in their countries. And this has been the problem for the United States and its allies from the beginning of this war. It turns out that whatever the US and its allies does against Iran, Iran has the ability and preparedness to go up the same escalation ladder. So if they block Iranian ports, they will destroy the ports in the Gulf states. If the Americans destroy desalination plants, they can do the same in the Gulf states. So Iran has the ability to hold out longer as well, due to many benefits which the Gulf states don't have. So this is a key problem for the Americans, that the Iranians can go up the escalation ladder. And this is very different. This is a good signal that the hegemonic era of the United States is over, because they enjoyed escalation dominance for decades now, knowing that if they go up and escalate, at some point their adversary would have to bow and essentially capitulate. But this is not the case with Iran. If anything, we see if Iran gets hit a lot, it can try to absorb the pain and the deaths. If the similar instability occurs in Qatar or Saudi Arabia, the huge amount of foreign workers will leave. If Iran's desalination plants are destroyed, then they can still get water from other sources, from their mountains. In the Gulf states, they will end up only in a desert. So the Iranians have advantage in many ways. Same as their cheap drones, which has to be intercepted with America's expensive interceptive missiles. So overall, they see themselves being in a position of advantage. The only thing the United States seemingly can do is cause a lot of the destruction, and hoping that all the devastation may force the Iranians to capitulate. I think what the Americans aren't calculating is that the Iranians see this as an existential threat. They effectively can't yield because if they give up their ballistic missiles, their drones, their regional partnerships, then they will be very exposed. And they see that the end goal of Israel and the United States is ultimately the destruction of Iran, making it into a new Syria. So they're not gonna give. So they're gonna simply try to absorb the pain, and they're gonna be able to dish out a similar pain, if not more, for America's allies.
And you explained it really fully. So it does look like it's a standoff. It looks like who's going to blink first. But realistically, if you look at this, comparing Iran and the U.S. with its warships and its power and money, how long can Iran stand?
Well, that's the real question, and I would be careful to say anything with too much certainty because I don't know how much weapons they have in their storages. I don't know that. I don't know. We don't know that much about their industrial capacity. What we do know is that a lot of their weapons, such as the drones, are easy to make. They're cheap to make. They're also fairly decentralized. So it's so the US can't really knock out its production capabilities. They have the know-how, they have all the material, so they can continue to pump out these kind of weapons. And so all they have to do essentially is hold out and continue to strike. Meanwhile, the US faces real economic hardship if they keep this going, and also its limits for how long they can keep this military campaign going as well. And when it comes to their allies, the Gulf states, they might not be able to recover from this simply because, their demographics, their dependence on energy exports, and so I don't want to say anything with too much certainty, but it looks like Iran has a lot of advantage, which is why it's holding out. I think this is where Trump miscalculates because, as you correctly say, the United States has a bigger economy. It has a more powerful military. It can create a lot of pain for the Iranians, as Trump always points out. They can kill a lot of their people. They can destroy their ships. They can, bomb bridges. But at the end of the day, this is not what's going to determine, I think, the outcome of the war. So I think as long as the Iranians are able to absorb the pain and continue to have the industrial capacity to make the weapons required to hit back at the United States and its allies, time will be on Iran's side.
Well, it does look like a standoff, but to see who blinks first, we'll have to wait and see for any development. But thank you so much, Dr. Deason, for joining us and giving your perspective. I appreciate it.
Thank you.